Perhaps you got the message this time at this 7th conference of Models for Change, and the message is the message. What we've learned through Models for Change must be taught to a broader audience, and we can't just talk to ourselves. So that's the message. We really have to expand our listening audience, our listening with both eyes and ears. Richard Ross did a great job of showing us how to tell a story through a picture. Yesterday's panel did a marvelous job, the communications and storytelling panel, in giving us the crystallization of that thought is how do we talk to others about what we do. The workshop yesterday on help telling America's untold juvenile justice stories brought John Fleming from the Juvenile Justice Information Exchange to show us how to message and print on the web. Jenna Gibson from CBS This Morning showed us what you can do with video in real time. Koki Smith from Youth Today showed us again how print can expand our message. They gave us real nuts and bolts tools, and I'll remind you that the video booth is still open, and it would be wonderful if you would stop in there for a while to not only teach others, but learn something about your own presence in front of the camera. But the truth is that language is the key to all of those methods, including video. Our colleague Esther Franco-Payne raised this question this morning. How do we refer to kids who have committed sexual behavior offenses? How do we get beyond the label of juvenile sex offender? Because the mind stops there for many people. It's language that can lead us through. The Washington Colloquies monograph that you'll find outside points out how to speak to children in the courtroom, how to speak to children in probation and service delivery. That's so extraordinarily important, past the jargon of judges, which I have certainly been guilty of. So because of that today, it's my absolute privilege to introduce a master of words. Cheryl Corley is NPR's Chicago Bureau. She travels throughout the Midwest, covering issues and events throughout the region's 12 states as a national desk reporter. In recent years, she has reported on the campaign and re-election of our president, Barack Obama, and on the efforts by Illinois officials to rethink how to operate and design the juvenile justice system. And I'll remind you that our director of the Department of Juvenile Justice, Arthur Bishop, is part of that method, and he was a champion for change yesterday. Cheryl has reported on youth violence in Chicago, on the Trayvon Martin shooting in Florida, in the tornadoes in Harrisburg, Illinois, and Oklahoma, and Joplin, Missouri. She's also been a part of that group of NPR reporters covering the devastation caused by Hurricanes Rita and Katrina that tore through the Gulf Coast. So she's seen real life in Models for Change states. She serves as a fill-in host on NPR shows, my favorites, Weekends on All Things Considered, Tell Me More, and Morning Edition. Before she joined NPR, Cheryl was the news director at Chicago's public radio station, WBEZ. And I wish all of you would come to Chicago for 1 week to listen to the quality of reporting around all things Illinois, but certainly around juvenile justice. Cheryl and Rob Wildeboer have been real stalwarts in letting the world know what juvenile justice is. She's earned countless awards at every level of journalism. She's a Chicago native. Cheryl Corley graduated cum laude from Bradley University in Peoria, Illinois, and she's now a Bradley University trustee. While in Peoria, she worked as a reporter and news director for public radio station WCBU and as a television director for the NBC affiliate WEEK-TV. She's a past president of the association. I lost my place. She's past president of the Association for Women Journalists in Chicago. She's also the co-creator of the Cindy Bandel Young Critics Program. That critics journalism training program for female high school juniors is a collaboration between AWJ and the Goodman Theater. Cheryl Corley has also served as a board member of Community Television Network, an organization that trains Chicago youth in video and multimedia production. So she's in the work, not just reporting on it. You know, Models for Change is 7 years old, and those who began 7 years ago probably were looking at this 5, 10, or 15 years before that time. We lived an education that wasn't taught, and for some time was not known. Models for Change has moved this knowledge along through research and the experience of the Illinois, Pennsylvania, Louisiana, and Washington state delegations, as well as the national networks. Now it's time to tell those stories. So it's a special person who can grasp the importance of juvenile justice, assimilate the lessons we have learned, and tell the message to others. To an audience who knows little about juvenile justice, in words that they can understand, without pictures, without video, without an experiential context, on the radio. To use the words this way requires skill, craft, and art. Our guest, an American artist, Cheryl Corley.
Thank you so much, Judge. Whenever I feel down, I'm going to call you up. I'd also like to thank Nancy Gannon-Hornberger with the Coalition for Juvenile Justice and to Lori Garducki with the MacArthur Foundation for the invitation to speak to you all today at the Models for Change Conference, and congratulations on your 7th year. That's a milestone. Well, as it's been pointed out to you in the introduction, I am primarily a general assignment reporter who covers all types of stories. And some of them are about juveniles, and we'll hear a bit of those stories in just a few moments. By looking at your workshops that you had, I know you've been thinking about how to tell the country's juvenile justice stories and using storytelling as tools for change. So now I'd like you all to stop for just a moment and think about the stories involving young people that you've heard on the radio or watched on television or on some mobile device in the past year or so. That may not be difficult for a crowd like yours. But when I asked some colleagues who don't work with juveniles or pay much attention to youth issues to do the same thing, it took a few moments. So what kinds of stories are really told about juveniles? So here's what my office mates came up with. They talked about the apparent Taliban shooting of a 15-year-old Pakistani girl who was an advocate for educating girls. They remembered stories about the Chicago school strike, the first in 25 years, and how that affected children. And they talked about seeing stories about kids and technology and the trouble that can come from it, like stories about juveniles using phones to take provocative photos, or sexting as it's called. So I also conducted my own little informal survey of news stories about juveniles that made the news in November. What did I find? Stories about a 17-year-old teenager accused of kidnapping and killing a 10-year-old Colorado girl. An update on the Supreme Court's June decision about abolishing mandatory life sentences without parole for juveniles convicted of murder. In Ohio, a story about a custody hearing removing 6 children from their home after accusations that their parents had abused them. And in Miami, a story about a South Florida teen charged with shooting a girl in front of her younger sister and other students as they were all riding a bus to school. Lots of crime news. And a story about a photo exhibit, which has been on display here, Juvenile Injustice, Richard Ross's exhibit, which he talked to you about yesterday. This year, there have also been plenty of stories about juveniles and bullying, and of course, one of the biggest stories occurred earlier this year when an unarmed teenager in Sanford, Florida, was shot by a neighborhood watch volunteer. And that fatal shooting of Trayvon Martin occurred in February. It took several weeks to draw the nation's attention. And when it did, a plethora of news stories followed, focusing on a number of issues, including how young people are perceived. So, what makes these stories about juveniles news? What are reporters looking for? Well, we look for the same factors that make any news story newsworthy. Is this a story that's timely? Is it significant? Would someone outside of an immediate area care about this news? That's particularly important for a network like NPR. Is there some conflict or tension, or is it simply interesting? Many, if not all of those factors were present as I worked on the story last summer that Judge Timberlake talked about the juvenile justice system in Illinois. And it was with the help of a group, Youth Outreach Services in Chicago last August, that I met a young man on Chicago's west side. His name was Elias Roman. He was 17 years old at the time. He lived in a Chicago neighborhood called Little Village. It's because of the number of Mexican Americans who make that area their home. And Elias was born there. He grew up there. He joined a gang there, and he got in trouble there. And it's where, as he put it, he caught his first gun case. And eventually he would end up locked up in one of the state's juvenile facilities. What I would learn as a reporter is that Elias was one of many, and that, as most of you know, there are about 71,000 juveniles locked up in residential facilities. In Illinois, I would learn at the time, there were 7 operating juvenile correctional facilities in the state, and about 1,000 juvenile offenders lived in them. Another 1,600 were on parole. Elias was one of the main stories in that cover story about the juvenile justice system in Illinois that I would write for Weekends on All Things Considered. So let's take a listen to a bit of what was broadcast. 2 years ago, Elias was 15 years old, a gangbanger, and like a lot of kids he ran with at the time, he had a gun. Out late one night, the cops picked him up. He was charged with gun possession. So what happened to you then? After they caught you, you got sentenced, or what exactly?
They took me to detention center for a month, and they put me on EM.
What is EM?
A house arrest. Put me on house arrest. I cut that off, and I was on the run for like 2-3 months, and then until they ended up catching me back over here.
Elias cut off the electronic monitor the Department of Juvenile Justice had placed around his ankle to keep up with him. 4 months later, he was picked up again, charged with unlawful use of a weapon, this time a lot longer stint in the state's juvenile centers. Did you ever see your parole officer the first time around?
No, the first time around for my first gun case?
Mm-hmm.
No, I didn't. I hardly didn't even talk to him.
The second time was different. The state assigned a mentor to work with Elias and his family, part of the effort in Illinois to reduce the recidivism rate of juvenile offenders. And when he was released, says Elias, he had an entirely different mindset.
I was out here and I have nothing doing for myself. That's how I ended up in bars. Because I didn't have a job. I wasn't going to school. I was just being out here being a bum.
And that's different now.
Yeah, I got stuff in my mind to do. I got a kid. I got a job. I'm trying to go back to school. And I got things in my head now, positive things. The weather is turning. The cover story on Weekends on All Things Considered.
Snow is melted.
Well, that's me again. But the cover story on Weekends on All Things Considered is an in-depth examination of a single subject. It's typically topical. It's news of the day, but not always. And it's generally about 20 minutes long, and that's a long time in broadcast news. A team of producers and the show's hosts meet weekly, and they throw out ideas. They look at news calendars, what's happening around the country, and they come up with a cover story idea for the week or for a couple of weeks. And in August, I was substituting for the regular weekend ATC host, Guy Raz. And typically when there is a substitute host, he or she will bring a story from their area. So I suggested a number of possibilities for the cover story, and how Illinois was working to change the juvenile justice system was one of them. A report from the Illinois Juvenile Justice Commission, chaired by Judge Timberlake, called the state's prison system, the youth prison system, an expensive failure, with more than half of the young offenders detained returning to the system within 3 years of their release, many for technical parole violations, or as Judge Timberlake put it, typical teenage behavior. So to me, those were just really mind-boggling numbers. And while there are a number of reforms across the country, reform efforts, it was extremely interesting to us to see just what exactly was in the works in Illinois, in a state where the juvenile justice system cut its teeth, and to see whether the original intent of juvenile justice, of rehabilitation, was a viable step back to the past for the future. So I wanted to talk not just to the adults who are hoping to change the way juvenile offenders are handled and to cut down on who are working to cut down on the recidivism rate, but also to the juveniles who were or continue to be a part of the system. Because too often, people who aren't doing the work that you do don't look at people who are in prison as people. They end up they're invisible. They're not seen by many of us as part of us. So one of our goals was really just to let them be heard, to let them tell their story, as well as to tell the story about the efforts that were underway in Illinois. So our story was about listening to the voices of young people who were paying a price for doing something wrong, while learning what was the impetus behind the change in Illinois and whether the public could really buy into a strategy that some could perceive as soft on crime. And in Illinois, part of the reasoning, honestly, is cost. The difference between a whopping $90,000 to house a juvenile in the state's juvenile facilities, while the cost of community-based services ranges between $4,000 and $10,000 annually. Nobody pitched this story to me. But as I read about the pilot program, I thought this is a great story. You know, it's just what I was looking for particularly for a cover story. It was timely, it was significant, it was about change, it was about real people. And I got tremendous assistance from Heidi Miller and others at Youth Outreach Services, and from Illinois' Juvenile Justice Division, Director Arthur Bishop, and the department's press operative, Ashley Cross, and other staff members there who helped me kind of work my way through the system. It was important to tell this story because it was the other end of a story that's often in the news. The year before, I and David Shaper, another reporter at the NPR Bureau in Chicago, had spent a considerable amount of time working on a series about youth violence in Chicago, the prevalence of it in some Chicago communities, and the efforts that were being taken by a number of organizations and the school system to try to put a dent in the number of kids being wounded or shot to death. Now, 3 years ago, Attorney General Eric Holder said, "We simply cannot stand for an epidemic of violence that robs our youth of their childhood and perpetuates a cycle in which too many of today's victims become tomorrow's criminals." Now, he was responding to the 2009 beating death of Chicago high school student Darian Albert. The cell phone video of that fight between a group of students near a community center a few blocks from the high school where they went viral and made international news. Darian Albert was not a shooting victim, but other school-aged children have been. And what my colleague and I found as we examined the numbers of shootings involving school-aged children in 2010 was that the chronic problem of youth violence in Chicago wasn't getting much better. Our story aired in March of last year, so we're going to take a listen to a portion of it. The weather is turning in Chicago.
The snow has melted and kids are beginning to spend more time outdoors.
In some Chicago neighborhoods, that's dangerous.
High school senior Marcus Spies knows that all too well.
When I got shot, it wasn't no pretty sight to feel. all I felt was burning in my whole right ribs. If I would never got to the hospital in time, I would have been paralyzed all my life. I'm just glad to be here.
We talked to Marcus at an anti-violence dinner
He lives in Roseland, a tough South Side neighborhood.
where gang fights claim lives and wound many.
And Spy says the gangs wanted him to join.
They were like, if you don't join the gang, we gonna have to jump on you. I'm like, y'all doing some petty stuff for jumping on people that don't want to get in the gang.
Marcus thinks one of the gangs made good on its warning last summer, shooting him while he took out his family's garbage.
At first, I heard something flat past me. I'm like, it wasn't nothing, so I kept on walking. The second time, it hit me in my right rib cage.
Marcus lived to tell his story. Far too many teens don't.
In 2010, almost 700 school-age children between the ages of 5 and 18 had been hit by gunfire in Chicago. 66 of them died, and at least half of those deaths were gang-related. Ironically, the number of violent crime, percentage of violent crime, has been going down in Chicago, and it continues to do so. A police analysis showed that 8.5% of the city contained all of the shooting and homicides. So for nearly 90% of Chicago, it's safe. But for people who happen to live in that 8.5%, it's a very different place to be. So we had many conversations with our editor, Vicki Walton, as we crafted this series, because we had conventions to deal with. How many pieces could we do? What shows would they air on? We started out with 5 pieces for NPR's Morning Edition program. It eventually became 7 and included the weekend shows as well. So we wanted to explore the anti-violence initiatives that were underway to keep kids safe. Primarily programs that were set in high schools and funded with federal stimulus dollars, like one called Safe Passage, which was to ensure that students could get back and forth to school safely through various neighborhoods and gang turf. There was another called the Culture of Calm, which took steps to train students in conflict resolution and in leadership, along with extra social services and mentoring programs. During that time, I talked to several young people looking for someone who had survived a shooting and someone who had used guns and was willing to tell their story too. Now, that was a very delicate process, especially since confidentiality is such a key issue with stories surrounding juveniles. And also, we wanted to make sure it was important to us, though, to have that sort of juvenile voice on the air. Important to put it in some sort of context. I mean, you see these stories on the front pages of newspapers every day, right? But we wanted to hear a young person involved in shooting about why they were involved. Getting consent to use their voices is a pretty standard process at NPR. We have a fairly strict policy that I always quibble about not using audio or interviews if we are not able to use a person's name. So eventually, I turned to Ceasefire, an anti-violence group that I had worked with before for Entree. 17-year-old Korshana Hatter was a client. She had found out about the group when some of its workers were passing out flyers near her alternative high school. And I spoke with her in a small room where Ceasefire had rented office space in a 2-story house on Chicago's far south side. Korshana is a slim girl. The day I talked to her, she had on one of those big puffy jackets. Her hair was in Shirley Temple curls. She had been in and out of foster homes since she was 7 years old. And at the time, she was on probation after being charged for getting into an argument with the police. She had survived a barrage of bullets just a few weeks before she turned 17 years old in the neighborhood where she was staying. Roseland is an area that struggles with guns and gangs. The Ceasefire office is where outreach workers counsel high-risk youth. They help them stay in school. They help them find jobs. It's a space where they can safely tell their stories. Now, Korshana had been out walking with her boyfriend. It was about 11:30 at night. They saw two other people on the street, but they weren't really paying much attention to them. But one passed a gun to the other, who fired 3 shots, first at Korshana's boyfriend. And here's how she talked about it.
And only one of the bullets hit him, but I didn't know that only one hit him. I thought all of them hit him, so I thought he was on the ground, on the side of the car, laying there bleeding to death. So I was in shock. Then I turned back around, and that's when the boy started shooting me.
And what happened? Where did you get shot?
I got shot twice in my arm, 3 times in my stomach, and 1 time while he was in the house.
1 time in her leg. Now, the experts I spoke with who've been studying the response on community violence on Chicago's South Side said there are common after effects: aggression, depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress. And he said that schools really should teach students how to cope with violence, because youth can be emotionally injured by what they see. Now, there is a system-wide school response when a young person is killed. But Dexter Voisin, a researcher at the University of Chicago, says that really doesn't account for the vast majority of types of violence that kids are exposed to. So he thinks that there should be this ongoing attention to coping with violence actually in the school curriculum. Now, when Korshana was shot, she didn't know at first how badly she'd been hurt. She had on her headphones, she'd been listening to music. Her boyfriend was shot in the leg, but was still able to run home and notify his family. His mother called the police, and here Korshana picks up the story again.
Then while he was in the house, his cousin was down there talking to me while I was on the ground, trying to keep me up or whatever. And the police arrived, and then my boyfriend asked me, his mama, was I gonna be all right? She said, yeah, because I was still listening to my music and stuff.
The music, says Korshana, helped pull her through. She gestures towards the front of her jacket, bringing her hand down from her chest to her waist.
They had to cut my stomach open, like from right here to right here. And I had to go home like that.
Korshana says she used to have dreams about being shot, but never believed it would happen. When it did, she says she knew who shot her, a boy in the neighborhood. She says the boy's best friend was shot a week earlier as she and others sat on a porch. She says the boy was out for revenge.
I just think he had an anger problem. The boy, I think he had an anger problem. He tried to shoot everybody that was on the porch that night when his friend got shot.
Despite the violence that engulfed her, Korshana says she's not worried about her safety or afraid of the streets, but she doesn't believe the violence will ever stop.
No, because people don't care. They don't have no feelings.
They don't have no feelings, she said. The thing that really amazed me about my interview with Korshana Hatter was when she described the young man who actually shot her. And she said, I think he just had an anger problem. An anger problem. I said, wow. And that sense of recognition, even though it's there, another expert we talked to, the co-director of the University of Chicago Crime Lab, said there is evidence that young people can overcome violence in their neighborhoods and that we shouldn't become discouraged. As Professor Harold Pollack put it, we can take a nihilistic approach if we want and talk about all the money we've spent over the decades on youth violence. But we've also spent a lot of money on cancer over the decades. People still die of it, but there are effective cancer treatments too. So what he said we need is critical optimism, plus a realization that curbing violence will take time. So as my editor and I talked about listening to and hearing from a survivor, we also wanted the other side of the equation. We wanted to hear from a young person who had been a perpetrator. I talked to a number of people who were willing to speak to me when I approached them face to face. But When I tried to reach them later, they weren't around. So Ceasefire was, again, my conduit. And I met Deontay Brooms in the same room where I spoke with Corshana Hatter. Deontay was 17 at the time as well, a junior at Fenger Academy High School, that school that gained notoriety a few years ago when that cell phone video of the beating death of that student went viral. Deontay is very small, young guy, very winning smile, close cropped hair. He comes from a very large family and was very open about his young life. He was on probation for getting into an altercation with a school security guard. And when he was on the verge of getting kicked out of school, Ceasefire helped prevent it. Before he got involved with that group, Deontay told me he used to rob people, he used to shoot at people, break into their houses, sell drugs, and do anything he could to get money. And his life in a gang started when he was about 11 or 12 years old. And here's Deontay talking about his shooting days.
The reason why I started shooting is because, you know, people hating and everything, you know, hating on me, trying to take advantage of my size and everything, you know. I couldn't beat everybody with the hands, you know. I ain't saying like I lost any fights or nothing like that. It's just if they grab ass, I'm going to get mad.
So if they had their gun,
Yes.
you were going after your gun.
Yes.
Did that happen a lot?
Yes.
Deontay Brooms told me that he was no longer selling drugs or fighting, that he wasn't reckless. What changed him, he said, was people telling him in his ear that he didn't have to do what he was doing. And the people who were telling him that had lived the same experience. He called it real talk. Now, the U.S. Justice Department says the ceasefire strategy is effective, and that the group's interventions and work with young gang members has helped decrease shootings and killings. We hear a lot about gangs when it comes to youth violence. But as everyone in this room is aware, the causes of youth violence are complex. A few years ago, the Chicago police superintendent at the time, Jody Weiss, said he recognized that. But he said the police are the police, not step-parents. Even so, the department started to work on different strategies to tackle the problem. Police commanders and school principals, for example, used an instant communication system to work with the schools and discuss any brewing troubles that might be happening in the schools that could spill out on the streets. And at the time, special police teams worked to ward off any gang-related fights and shootings. The schools also set up other programs. The culture of calm and safe passage, too, I mentioned earlier, were elements reported on by my colleagues during that series. And one of the academics at the Center for Youth Violence at the University of Illinois, Chicago, told us that much of the focus is on high school students, and that's justifiable, but there's almost too much talk about helping kids already in trouble, and very little discussion about how we stop kids from getting there in the first place. So, one of the reports in our series was about a program that tries to address that issue. BAM, or Becoming a Man, is the purview of a social service agency called Youth Guidance. BAM operated in 16 Chicago public schools when I studied it, in high schools, but also in elementary schools. And most of the kids involved are at risk of failing. They have some sort of behavior problems, or they simply have no positive male role models in their lives. They meet in weekly sessions where BAM counselors conduct clinical assessments, they provide individual counseling and if it's needed, and they consult with teachers. And its goal is really to reach youngsters before the gangs do. It was created by a social worker, Tony DiVittorio. For him, it's really a labor of love. And I met him at Little Village Academy in Chicago, where he was working on a team building exercise with a group of 8th grade boys in the school gym. So here's Tony DiVittorio now, getting these young boys to navigate their way over some imaginary lava.
And if you step on it with your body, you burn up. And if you burn up, everyone burns up. These plates are the only thing that can get you across.
The goal is for everyone to get across. Di Vittorio demonstrates, throwing a plate on the floor, stepping on it, lifting his foot to advance to a second plate, while another BAM counselor steps on the first. It's a coordinated dance, and the boys try to follow suit.
You just start putting them down and get across. Go ahead.
The students strategize, they wobble and lean and stretch to reach the paper plates one after the other. Sometimes it gets a little precarious as they misstep and tumble into the pretend pool of lava.
It's because they went too fast.
What do you need to do different now to get across?
Hold hands.
Balance. How do you get balance? How do you get balance? Holding each other. That's a good idea.
It's a fun activity for the boys, but social worker Di Vittorio is thinking clinically.
The real purpose of the group mission is group cohesion. As a facilitator, I'm looking to see how they're respecting each other, how they're working together. If they pass it or they fail it, at the end we talk about it. We talk about what their successes were. If there was blaming going on, we talk about things like that. And then we start to generalize that to outside of the group.
These were boys who were 13 and 14 years old. They looked so sweet, very angelic. But by this age, they know many kids who join gangs at their age or even younger. So what BAM does is what Di Vittorio calls a critical piece. They engage in what he calls men's work, where students sit in a circle and discuss topics that many consider taboo, their feelings, what makes them sad or angry. And it's based on the idea, says Di Vittorio, that there is no standardized rite of passage for a boy to become a man in our society. So they talk about what are the core principles of the BAM curriculum: integrity, accountability, and positive ways to express anger. The University of Chicago Crime Lab evaluated BAM and is doing so with other programs designed to curb youth violence to see whether, in the case of BAM, one man's labor of love could work across a school system. And BAM cost about $1,000 per person and is considered promising. Now, the kids I talked to after their session with Tony at Little Village Academy told me that BAM helped them learn how to control their emotions, how to handle certain situations, and essentially teaches them about life. One kid said, "We learned how to express ourselves and how to be true. Like, it's not about the gangs, not about any of that. It's about living life good." Now, those are some of the stories, my stories, about juveniles. Increasingly, young people have taken it upon themselves to tell their own stories. Nearly 20 years ago, there was a groundbreaking program called Ghetto Life 101, and it became the most acclaimed program in public radio. Lee Allen Jones and Lloyd Newman were 13 and 14-year-old kids in Chicago who collaborated with radio producer David Isay and created an audio diary of their life in Chicago. Now, there are groups like Radio Rookies in New York and Youth Radio, which won a Peabody Award for its story about the sex trade of minors in Oakland, largely through the firsthand accounts of victims. Their stories often air on NPR. Now, our goal as we report these stories is to give our audience, the public, a better sense of young people, a better sense of the issues that concern them. And we just really want to simply let their voices be heard. So, thank you for listening.